Thanks very much, Jane. So you're welcome, everybody. For those of you who can hear me right now, to week 7 of attention-based training. Apologies for the delayed start today. I think we have a bit of a Microsoft glitch, wherever that might be, but that's par for the course, isn't it? So as I said, we're at week 7, and we're coincidentally week 7 into the lockdown as well, which is interesting. So as usual, we'll have a little bit of a recap of last week. We will practice the body scan. We'll go through what we're going to talk about this session, which actually won't be too involved this week. As I said, the last day gets shorter and shorter as we move towards week 8. And then we'll end with a 5-minute meditation and a summary of what you need to do during the week. So I hope you managed to get some practice in during the week and that it's going well for you. You might remember last week that we really discussed the whole area of acceptance. And I tried to use the finger trap puzzle as a kind of an analogy in how you would be able to face adversity and engage in acceptance. And you remember the idea of the finger trap, that it's a puzzle made of bamboo where you stick your index fingers in either side. And naturally, the human tendency is to pull away. And when we do that, the finger trap tightens our fingers and we actually get more trapped. So paradoxically, the solution of the finger trap is to actually move toward your index fingers. So it's counterintuitive for the way humans tend to react towards adversity. We tend to want to run away, head for the hills generally. And in the finger trap, if we move toward, in terms of moving the index fingers inward, then we get released. And for me, it's quite a useful analogy for acceptance and how we generally react towards adversity. So as I said here, the paradox is freedom. And I also mentioned the fact that acceptance involves an aspect of surrender. And sometimes this word can irritate people or upset some people. And I mean surrender in a very specific way, which is more closely linked to the word acceptance. And I certainly do not mean, which I've highlighted here again, that we become a victim of circumstance or that we tolerate any type of negative thing in our lives, because that's clearly not sufferable. But the point of last week was that we have a list. And in the left column, we have those things that we can control that are within our sphere of influence. And then on the right column, we have those things that are outside our control. So for example, a government lockdown during a pandemic. So the idea is that if we have a list of those items we can control, then we do something about controlling those, but we actively cultivate acceptance to the items that are beyond our control. So that was really the broad message of last week. And really, we ended up saying that this is quite a difficult thing to do. It's not going to happen overnight, and especially with very large things that are beyond our control, which create anxiety, such as COVID-19 pandemic. But the idea is that we can use the core attention-based training practice to help cultivate this acceptance and try and manage it internally and externally. And speaking of the core attention-based training practice, I'm going to remind you again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. Again, we assume the upright posture because we believe that's the best way to begin practice. But as the weeks progress, and we're in week 7 now, so we're well into this program, 1 week to go. By now you should be generating your own bespoke practice. And this means that if you're more comfortable sitting in a lotus position on your bed or at the base of your bed or outside in the garden or lying down, as long as you're not going to sleep, that's perfectly fine. We introduce the upright position initially so that people don't fall asleep when they're practicing. So that's where we introduce the upright position. We also do that because I think I mentioned initially that your body and mind will do anything it can to sabotage your practice. So this position is actually a relatively neutral position, especially if the back is not rigid. And it allows us to have the minimum amount of aches and pains and issues like that. Because if the body does develop aches and pains, it will be another thing that will be used to sabotage your practice. So as ever, we use one of 2 anchors in attention-based training. As I described previously in other weeks, there are many, many different types of meditation. We're talking about focused, concentration-based meditation. And in this type of meditation, we can use one of 2 anchors to help ground us. So one is a chosen phrase, and the chosen phrase that I have written here, excuse me, is I am here now. And I am here now is just one phrase you can use. You can also use many other mantras out there. These are also called mantras. And you can find many of them online if you're interested in. But I've just given one example here, which is I am here now. I am here now can be used as a mantra that's said on the inhalation and said on the exhalation. And it's an anchor to ground us. Another potential anchor, as you're now familiar with, is the breath. And the breath is always moving, and we can use it as an anchor because it's always moving. And in terms of the anchors themselves, we use them to help us disengage from thought, emotions, sensations, and memories by returning to either anchor on a moment by moment basis. Now, the important point is that we pick one anchor and we stick with that throughout, if possible, because it helps us from flip-flopping from one to the other. And the very simple core practice is we set our timer for however many minutes we're going to meditate that day. And we choose the anchor, which should be embedded in you at this point, breath or chosen phrase. No need to empty your mind. We can't stop our thinking process. It's a biological process that's going to go on whether we want it or not. And we use the anchor to disengage. As I said, the timer will go off and then we're back into the world again. So that's the basic core practice, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with now. So again, before we go into the theme of today, which I'll describe after our body scan, let's do the body scan. So as usual, we try and adopt the upright position if possible, with an upright but not rigid spine. And you have your feet firmly planted on the ground, and your hands gently resting on your lap or hanging down by your side, whatever is most comfortable. And then gently close your eyes. We usually begin the body scan by taking a deep inhalation before pausing and then exhaling slowly. And as ever, we start by bringing your attention to the toes of the left foot, including the big toe. We try to see if we can sense the individual toes, if we can. And from the toes of the left foot, we get a sense of the entire left foot, from the ankle to the heel, to the sole, top of the foot. Remember that we continue to breathe normally throughout this whole practice. From the left ankle, then we move into the left calf muscle. Each time we reach a large muscle group, we try to consciously relax this muscle. From the left calf muscle, then we move up into the left knee. And from the left knee, then slowly upward through the large muscle groups of the left thigh. Until we reach the left hip. And from the left hip, then we move across the pelvis, down the right leg until we reach the toes of the right foot. See if you can get a sense of the big toe on your right foot. And then we bring our attention to the whole of our right foot, the ankle, the heel, the sole, the upper part of the foot. From the right ankle, we move up into the right calf muscle until we reach the right knee. From the right knee then up into the large muscle groups of the right thigh, consciously relaxing the muscle. Move slowly up and around until you reach the right hip. And then from the right hip, we move around to the base of the back. From the base of the back, then we move up very slowly either side of the spinal column, relaxing the muscle as we move until we eventually arrive at the top of the shoulder blades. From the shoulder blades, then we move into the muscle of the left shoulder. Again, the shoulder muscles can often be very tight, so we consciously try to relax them. Relax your left shoulder. And from here, then we move slowly into the tips of the fingers of the left hand. Get a sense of your entire left hand, including your left thumb, palm and the back of your hand, your left wrist. We move from the left wrist to the lower left arm, the elbow. And then we consciously relax the muscles of the upper left arm. Get a sense of your entire left arm from shoulder to the tips of your fingers as one unit as it hangs from your shoulder. Next, we move across our shoulders to the right shoulder. Again, consciously relaxing the muscle here. And then we move down to the tips of the fingers of the right hand, the right thumb. We move into the back of the hand, palm of the hand, right wrist, the lower arm and the elbow. And then we relax the muscle of the upper right arm. Get a sense of your entire right arm now as it hangs from your shoulder. And from the right shoulder then, we move to the back of the neck. We get a sense of the head as it sits on your neck. Feel the weight of your head. And then we move slowly around to the jaw and the muscle of the jaw, left and right. Consciously relax your jaw muscles now. as we move up left and right, past your cheekbones, your temples, before smoothing out your forehead. And from your forehead then, relax the muscles around the eyes. Get a sense of your whole face. And then we move around to the back of the head, before slowly moving up to the top of the head and the scalp. And then before we finish, we take one long inhalation in. Then we let it out slowly. So that's the body scan, which I'm sure you're very used to at this stage, or hopefully you are. So into the topic of today. So today we're talking about total health, and this may seem like a little bit of a departure from the core of what we talk about with attention-based training, but hopefully you'll realize that at the end of today's session that actually has a very strong place in attention-based training and in helping to cultivate the system as a whole. And really what we're talking about here is total health. When I use this phrase today, what I mean is integrating exercises and practices that can cultivate both psychological or mental and physical health. So the whole package here. And as I've written here, that for optimal and most impactful attention-based training practice, so the core practice that we talk about, your body needs to be as healthy as it can be. Now, if you have some kind of disease process, a chronic disease or illness, obviously it's very hard to get your body to be 100% healthy. But as we discussed last week, we accept that and we move on and act as if we're doing the best we can, which we usually are. But it's important, if we're not undergoing some kind of disease process, that we try and get the body as fit as possible, which in turn will help our attention-based training practice. And then we'll very briefly look at what's called the blue zones. And these are areas on the planet where people live to be the longest. And we'll just discuss about maybe the activities and exercises that these people engage with, which might actually go toward helping them to live as long as they do. And then as a consequence of that, one of the blue zones is in Okinawa in Japan. And we'll just talk about very briefly, just one slide about Ikigai, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but we're going to talk about this Japanese philosophy called Ikigai, which I hopefully you'll realize at the end of the session makes a lot of sense in terms of our core attention-based training practice. So again, total health, really what we're talking about here is an integrated psychological and physical system and practices that help and assist this integration. And for me, and I think for most modern medicine and science now, we've realized that the whole Descartes philosophy, where we artificially separated the mind and the body, is now really old hat, and it doesn't really reflect what total health is, which is an integrated and combined physical and mental health for overall health and well-being. And really, in certainly in my opinion and in the opinion of lots of experts around the world in this area, that if we overemphasize one above the other, we tend not to get total health. So in other words, if we ignore the psychological and mental health side of things, that can have a negative impact on the body and vice versa. So it's important to actually strive for health in both zones, which are really one unit. And meditation practice, not just attention-based training, which I've said, and hopefully that will be clear now to you, that attention-based training is just one type of meditative practice, but any type of meditative practice will be good for helping you with things like anxiety toward COVID-19, for example. But if you picture this example here, that if you're providing a lot of attention for attention-based training, for example, you're doing even more than 10 minutes twice a day, and you're managed to introduce a lot of the satellite practices like the body scan, and you're really feeling good mentally, and you're gaining and garnering a stability mentally, if while simultaneously you're engaging in very good ABT practice, but that evening you're eating lots of junk food or you're drinking too much alcohol, it's actually going to be hard to control your anxiety no matter how much practice you're putting in with your ABT. And this might conversely then make you feel like ABT is actually not working. And really, for me, this is like the analogy of trying to rapidly fill a bucket of water that has a hole in it. We can try and try and try and try and try, but that bucket will always empty because there's a hole in it. So, in other words, if we want to have total health and fill that bucket, we need to plug the hole and we need to have combined psychological and physical health. And we need to try and engage practices that actually enable the two simultaneously. And that's what I've said there. So throughout this short talk today, I've just given or provided you with a few tables here with some sources. And these are really important, I think, and it's important to know that I'm not just making this up, that there's actually sound research behind this. And there are lots of research teams and very reputable universities around the world who are engaged in this type of research and these type of practices. So this doesn't just come out of nowhere. Really what I'm talking about here in terms of total health is lifestyle medicine. It's integrative medicine. And I would encourage you to go on these sites here that I've outlined in this box. I will also mention gut health, and I think gut health is quite important as well. And University College Cork have an elementary health unit, which is one of the world leaders in this field. And I would encourage you to read up on what the researchers are doing there, which is really stellar and fantastic work in my opinion. And the other thing to note before we go into these individual practices is that there's been a transition. Now you'll have to bear with me because really a lot of these texts were written without a global pandemic in mind. But putting that aside, as in the global pandemic, we've largely progressed into a different type of society in the 21st century. So everything before, let's say, the 1970s, the majority of people on Earth would have died from either malnutrition or some kind of infection. So we've moved away from these as the biggest killers. It's not that they've disappeared, and we know very well that they certainly haven't disappeared in the current climate, but that we've moved on to bigger killers in different scenarios. And the biggest killers of the 21st century are what are called non-communicable diseases. So in other words, they're non-infection based diseases. And they're largely diseases that are related to lifestyle. So for example, obesity that can lead to the development of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease in terms of hypertension, high blood pressure, development of heart attack and stroke and things like that. We also have issues with increasing depression, increasing suicide, unfortunately. Mental health issues are becoming predominant and leading to ill health and death right across the world. And we have some kinds of cancers that are a direct result of poor lifestyle. So we have lots of issues and lots of diseases that are developing in the 21st century that are related to lifestyle. Now, the good news here is that if they're related to lifestyle, well, then if we make changes to our lifestyle, we should be able to prevent these diseases from developing. And that does seem to be the case. So the bottom line for the 21st century, for the most part, is that prevention is better than cure. And what I'm going to talk about today in terms of total health are aspects of total health and exercises that we need to combine in order to help prevent these diseases developing for all of us in the 21st century. So let's go through these individual practices here. And I'm sure all of these will be a no-brainer to you, but it's important to highlight them now so that we can see them in context. So if we want to cultivate total health, it's obvious a no-brainer that we need to engage in some kind of exercise. Now, I'm not a physiologist, I'm not a physiotherapist, I'm not a medic, I'm not going to prescribe any type of exercise to you, but it is a no-brainer. There are many, many, many texts online and recommendations on how to do this in a healthy manner, the WHO being an example. So I'm not going to prescribe anything to you today. I'm just going to highlight the areas that need attention if we want to cultivate total health. So exercise is one. Sleep is another one. And I know a lot of people during the current pandemic are having a lot of issues with sleep, but sleep is core and crucial to our health, as I'm sure we're all aware of. Next, not usually highlighted, but it's emerging more and more in the scientific literature that gut health is really important for mental health and physical health. So it's worth giving this some attention. Obviously, you have to use the right materials, and I would inform yourself before you go and use something like probiotics, read up about it, and engage in the things that are reputable and good out there. mental health is a no-brainer, and hopefully the attention-based training program will go some way to help you understand and develop stable practices for good mental health. But there are other aspects that need to be developed as well. Relationships, this is something that's often left out of many health-based programs, and it's crucial. It's a social aspect of life. No man or woman is an island, and we're seeing that right now. We know that loneliness kills, for example. We know that relationships can create, or the presence or absence can create a lot of tension and stress in individuals, which can lead to ill health. So we're talking about here is cultivating positive relationships if we can. And actually, just to stick on relationships for one moment, that when I mean relationships, what I'm really talking about are your family, your friends, your colleagues and acquaintances, for example. So everything combined, all three knitted together. This is another one that's often neglected. So we tend to focus on the things that are the low-hanging fruit, such as the exercise, sleep, and diet, which I'll go to in a minute. But meaning and purpose is crucial to the stability, especially the psychological stability of a human being. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. Substance control is a big issue across the whole world. It's certainly an issue in Ireland. I know earlier in the year we had some good talks in the My Health series talking about substance control, specifically alcohol and tobacco, but there are other types of substances, not just narcotics and Class A drugs, but we could look at food, for example, in that setting where we might engage in comfort eating and eating the wrong types of food, like lots of junk food, for example. So we need to get some kind of control on these substances that we look toward when we feel stressed and anxious. And then the final no-brainer, which is probably the most obvious one, is a diet. Now, you don't have to go become full vegan and eat nothing at all to be healthy, but we have to be sensible about this. And I'll give you some examples of this as I go through the presentation today. But again, I just want to reiterate, I'm not prescribing anything to you. I want you to go away and find out the best practice here, but I just want to describe the practices that are used to help develop total health, psychological and physical. So this is an important question, and many people have had this in terms of total health or integrated health, however you want to call it. Who does this best around the world? Can we look at groups of individuals who do this very well, and can we learn from them and then bring them into our own cultures and societies and our own healthcare systems? And linked to that then, might we assume that those of us generally who live longer, are they healthier? Do they engage in these practices? What practices do they engage in? And can we learn something from these individuals? And it turns out we can. So many of you may have come across the blue zones before. If you haven't, I would really encourage you to go and read about it. I'm going to give you some resources here about the blue zones. They're fascinating areas around the world. And in the early noughties of the 21st century, what we had an individual called Dan Buettner, who worked with National Geographic in the US at the time, in conjunction with other national American research agencies. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to find out which parts of on Earth, geographical locations, had the people who lived the longest. And they did a lot of really important work here. So a lot of epidemiological work, looking at birth certificates and country stats and only reputable country stats and things like that. And what they came up with were 5 geographical locations where individuals lived the longest. So what we're talking about here are people who live to 100, so centenarians or older, where there's a 10% minimum increase in the amount of these individuals living in these locations. So you have a 10% greater chance of living to 100 and older in these societies. So the question is obviously, why do people live longer in these societies and these small geographical locations? And can we learn anything from this? And do they have actually anything in common? So in terms of the 5 geographical locations, they're very different cultures all across the world. And we can start here on the far right, which is the island of Okinawa, which is part of Japan. And then we move left, we get closer to home in the Mediterranean, and we see the island of Icaria of Greece. And then we see Sardinia, which is part of Italy, again, another island state. And then we move from the Mediterranean across the Atlantic to Central America, and we look at the Nicoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica. And then we move up to a small area, small town actually, in California called Loma Linda. So what have these areas got in common? So Dan Buettner and researchers all around the world in collaboration have found that these societies, and I'm not going to go into the in-depth description of these societies, but I would encourage you on the right here, you can see I put in the Blue Zone website and a Blue Zone article that will help you get a better understanding of the Blue Zone project. But suffice it to say that after 15 years of research, these researchers have really combined attributes that are common to all of these 5 geographical locations. And they call these attributes the power 9. So these are the 9 attributes in terms of behavior that these individuals engage in who live to be at least 100 and older. And if we just take from the left here and we go around to the right, what we can see is downshift. So this isn't always easy to do. We're downshifting as a world really now. But if you imagine pre-COVID-19, the majority of our worlds were rapid, fast-paced. And when we look at these 5 geographical locations, what you find is that if they're not always rural, they tend to have a downshift capacity to their society. So they're not as fast-paced as the more urban societies. Then, you might remember I mentioned purpose a couple of slides ago. What you find is that purpose and meaning in life is very, very important to these groups of individuals. Again, common to all 5 geographical locations. So these individuals wake up with meaning and purpose. They feel they have a position in the world. They feel they have a role to play, not just in terms of as individuals or in their families, but for their societies. This thing here that the Blue Zone project called the plant slant is quite interesting, I think, in my opinion, and I'll delve a little bit further into that in one moment. The bottom line here is that the majority of people in these societies eat a lot less meat. Now, they're not all vegetarians, but they eat a hell of a lot less meat. Something that might be a little bit controversial, what these guys have found is that especially the Mediterraneans and those in Costa Rica, they tend to have a glass of wine each day. So that may or may not be good depending on what culture you come from. And I don't think it's as important as the others as far as I'm concerned personally. You'll also find that there's a big, heavy emphasis on family among individuals who are from these geographical locations. Family is always first. Family is very important. The extended family is very important. Elders are respected, but so are the young. So these are healthy relationships, like the relationships I talked about to you a couple of slides ago. This is a quite unique attribute here, and it seems to be an attribute of the Okinawans in Japan, where they have this philosophy called Hari-Hachi-Bu, which is an ancient Confucian philosophy, I think, which boils down to this: I only eat until I'm 80% full. So when I feel like I'm 80% full, then I stop eating. And obviously this reduces your calorie intake. Now, personally, I would find this quite hard to do, but this seems to be a big player in terms of many of these groups. So while the Okinawans have the 80% rule, many of the rest of them would have a much reduced calorie intake compared to the average individual in the West, for example. This item here is another important part, which is moving naturally. So these individuals, they don't join gyms, they're not members of gyms, they don't run 15Ks in the morning, they don't swim 2Ks in the evening in their local swimming pools, but they all move naturally. They all have their own gardens. Many of them live in mountainous terrains, so even if you're 95, you're still walking up and down and up and down. They walk or cycle rather than use transport. They do their own chores in their houses, for example. They do their own vacuum cleaning. So if you're 102, you're still doing your own vacuum cleaning. They wash their own dishes. So they engage in what's called natural movement, and they're moving all the time. This is something else that's important in terms of these bottom two here, which are right tribe, which is directly linked to a sense of belonging. So these individuals, while they're not all religious in terms of their societies, they do have very strong central cultural beliefs. Now, some of those are religious and some aren't, but these beliefs tend to adhere these cultures together and again give them a sense of purpose, which we can look back and here on the left. So these are the power of 9 that the Blue Zones project look at. We might not be able to apply all these to our own lives, but you can get an idea that people who live longer on average, 10% longer, are doing things that are similar across the globe. in these 5 geographical locations specifically. So I think we can learn a lot from this in terms of the concept of total health. If we can make the body healthy, then when we engage in our attention-based training practice, we will reap even more rewards and benefit from that. So as I said, I promised that I would go a little bit deeper, just for a minute, into the plan slant idea of the Blue Zones project. And what we can see here, and I don't expect you to go into all of this in very much detail, but I just want to draw your attention to the amount of meat and fish that these individuals eat. So again, you'll find that by and large, there's not a lot of vegetarianism here. And this might be culturally, and it might be down to poverty over the centuries. For whatever reason, these societies eat a lot less meat. And this is interesting across all of these locations, right across the world, again, different social groups. So you can see, for example, the Okinawans, 2%, the Sardinians in Italy, 5%, in the Loma Linda, who are a group of Seventh-day Adventists, in California, they eat about 4% meat and poultry. And it's roughly the same in Icaria and Greece. So what these individuals do eat are a hell of a lot of fresh fruit and veg, and they eat legumes, and they eat lots of nuts. So it's a nice balanced diet. As I said, you don't have to become a vegan, but I think it's something that we could have a look at in our own lives and see, maybe could we do something that's approaching this kind of diet, because it's certainly advantageous in terms of living longer and in helping the development of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, for example. So if you are interested in the Blue Zones and the Blue Zone diet, you can go into these sites here, which will give you a lot more information. And again, this is based on a lot of scientific data and a lot of research that's out there. So in terms of the Blue Zones, I want to focus again on one specific Blue Zone, which is Okinawa in Japan. So this is an island off Japan. And I want to focus specifically on something that's called Ikigai. And again, I briefly mentioned on the introduction to today's session, and I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but you'll have to bear with me. For me, this is a fascinating concept. I think it's inherent to attention-based training practice. I think it's good practice in general, whether you engage in a meditative practice or not. And a lot of studies are emerging showing that if you can try at least address this scenario and this area of your life, that you will reap the rewards and benefits. And really what Ikigai seems to be translated, again, I don't speak Japanese, but I've included down here, which is an article by this Japanese individual on bbc.com, which provided this translation, which is that Ikigai is the reason why you get up in the morning. So when you wake, what are you waking up into? Are you delighted that you're awake in the day? Do you get up and get at them, as they say? Where do you find this meaning and purpose in your life? If it's not there, can you cultivate it? And the answer is yes, you certainly can cultivate it. Can you make it a way of life? Can you impart this message to your children, to your friends, to your family, or to your work colleagues? So really, and again, I'm not going to spend too long in this concept of Ikigai, but you can see here, and again, if you go in here, you'll find a lot more detail about Ikigai, and there's a lot of good books out there at the moment on it, which really describe this process, because a lot of companies in particular are fascinated by this, as you can imagine. If you can cultivate meaning and purpose in employees, then the idea is that there'll be better employees for you. But for me, it's just about being a human being that's invested in life. And it goes without saying that you're going to naturally be happier if you adopt this process. So if we just very briefly break it down, what we can see is that, and again, we'll talk about you trying to cultivate this in a moment. We can break down Ikigai. If we go out into the periphery of this figure here, you know what you're good at, or you should do at this stage in your life. Hopefully we're all adults here watching this at the moment. You should have an idea of what you're good at. And you'll have a good idea of what you love. So when you combine what you're good at and what you love, you get passion. And that means you'll have passion in whatever you engage it with that, right? Obviously, it's not always possible to do a job that we love, and sometimes needs must, and we need to acquire money, and we can't always do that. But I'm assuming that you can do this and you can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So if you combine, as I said, that which you love with your inherent skills that you develop through college or whatever means, and you have a passion for this job. Now, there's no point in having a passion in terms of what you love and what you're good at, in terms of Ikigai, I mean, if it doesn't have a place in society. And again, this is just falling into the Ikigai process here. So the idea is that you adopt what you love and what you're good at in terms of your skills. You enter into a profession where you really cement these skills and acquire other skills that develop them, and that becomes part of your vocation because you get paid for it, but also it serves a purpose in your society. So in other words, you're doing something that you love, you have an inherent aptitude for it, you train in that skill and you become upskilled in it, and maybe you get a degree, for example, or something like that. Hopefully then you get paid for it. And then what you do as your vocation serves a purpose in your society. And obviously there are thousands of examples of that. So hopefully many of you listening to this today have found your ikigai and this makes perfect sense to you, but it might not for everybody. And it might not be achievable at this present moment because, as I said, needs must, and we all need money, and we can't always get this perfectly right in our lives. But I think it's something that we can look at and aspire to and trying to cultivate. And this leads me to this current slide here, which really is talking about engaging the practices that cultivate total health. And as I said, in the world of the World Wide Web and the internet, we can have access to all reputable sound data from lots of good universities out there, including RCSI, and you can get the information here. Before you engage in any of these practices, like let's say changing your diet or going into some exercise programs, it's always a good idea to check with your healthcare professional. As I said, I'm not prescribing anything for you, but I think you need to have a look at these zones in your life. So my recommendation would be that you get a pen and paper, and as ever, you make your two columns, one on the left, one on the right, and you put in the aspects of cultivating total health, so the practices that are involved. And I put here what I think are, and this again is based on the blue zones and it's based on all of the research that's out there. Most of them are no-brainers, like exercise, diet, sleep, substance control, and maybe gut health. But the others, as I said, often get lost, such as meaning and purpose and the relationships in your life. So what I'd like you to do is maybe this evening or after this session today, get out your notebook, make your two columns, write down the different exercise, and give yourself a score out of 10. So let's pretend that a score of 1 is quite poor, as in you haven't really cultivated any type of exercise in that zone. Whereas number 10 is you're fantastic. You have a diet that's exactly like those in Icaria in Greece, for example. So you give yourself 10 there. Most of us are going to reside somewhere in the middle. I would suggest that after you make that table, anything really, I put 6 here, but really anything less than 5, I would say needs pretty immediate attention. We want to get overall balance here. We want to give our attention-based training a chance really to embed and do some real good for us. And in order for it to do that, we need to get the body right so that it can support the psychological process. So if, for example, this is just a made up example here, if your sleep's not good, which is not at the moment for most people, and that can be hard, when we try and do something about that, maybe we stop looking at screens and getting blue light up to an hour or two before going to bed. Look for good, reputable sleep hygiene programs and engage in those programs. In fact, there's a webinar next week in RCSI where I believe Dr. Annie Curtis is going to be talking about sleep. So check in with that webinar. If you're having issues with sleep, find out what good sleep hygiene is and engage it. Likewise with substance control, I know maybe a lot of us maybe are drinking that one glass too many at the moment. Maybe we could do something about that. Again, it's about moderation. It's not about going crazy in any one of those groups. It's just about a gentle assessment about where you are in any of these sectors at the moment. So check in with yourself on a monthly basis. See how you're doing in any of these areas. If, for example, relationships are an issue, well, then maybe you need to do something about that. Again, it's not always easy, but at least if you have some good intention and positive attention toward it, you might help change that aspect of your life and make things better overall. So again, cultivating total health is about cultivating the psychological and the physical together. In the context of attention-based training, all of these aspects will help develop and create a strong foundation that you can build your ABT practice upon. So that's the end of the topic for today. Again, week 7. Just like last week, we're upping the ante and we're moving from a 2-minute live practice to a 5-minute practice. And I think it's important for us to embed ourselves into that slightly longer practice so we get a feel of it even if we're not getting a feel of it during the week and you're finding it difficult to practice. So again, I'm going to set the timer for 5 minutes. And we adopt the upright position as usual, feet firmly planted on the ground, arms by your side or in your lap, whatever's most comfortable. And then you gently close your eyes. You should know what your anchor is by now. Each time you become distracted, simply return to your anchor. No need for fancy breathing, just breathe as usual. And we'll reconnect at the end of the 5 minutes. Okay, so that's the end of the 5-minute practice. Hopefully you're all still awake. I'm going to just have a bit of a quick stretch there before we finish up. So the practice goal for this week, we're going to jump up a minute, up until 9 minutes. The goal for next week will be 10 minutes. So hopefully you will have left the 8-week program with 10 minutes in the bag, morning and evening. I mentioned for the last couple of weeks now that for many people, again, I'm not saying for everybody, but for many people, they'll feel that this might not be long enough depending on which day they're practicing. And this is just a recommendation. So again, if you're hitting 5 minutes, that's okay. But if you're hitting 15 minutes, that's okay too. Whatever fits you at the moment, just as long as you practice, it's fine. And in terms of tips for the week, as always, if you're having difficulty practicing, don't allow it to drift away if you can. Try and pick 10 minutes, pull out your notebook, try and write down what the barriers are to your practice, and that will help you develop sustainable practice in the long run. And that goes for anything, including practices that cultivate total health that we talked about earlier today. And I would encourage you at least once a month to see how you score in each of the individual practices for creating total health. So from diet to exercise, substance control, meaning and purpose, and relationships and sleep. And note which of these practices you need to improve on. And then, most importantly, try and devise some kind of strategy rather than saying, okay, my diet at the moment is at 4 out of 10. I do need to improve it. And then you just get on with the week. Give it some attention. Put an hour aside, get out your trusty notebook again. Look at the tips and strategies for generating a new habit that we looked at in week 2 of the course. Pull out those strategies and engage them again in order to develop a new and sustainable habit for developing a new diet, for example. Maybe you want to adopt a more Mediterranean style diet, for example. As always, remember, there is no such thing as good or bad practice. There's just practice. So the really distracted one is just as good as the one that's tranquil. Might not feel that way at the time, but it is in its essence. Remember, no such thing as stopping any of these biological processes in your body. Your body is alive. That's what it wants to do. Our job is to disengage and return to the anchor, whatever that anchor might be for you. So that's the end of today's session. Thanks very much. Last session next week. Good luck with your practice.